This reading, I had read the entire Alexander's Feast about John Dryden's, and we are continuing the analysis. Writers in English for the 100 years previously had used as an instance of the power of music the story of how Alexander the Great, in the version of John Case from the Praise of Music, quote, sitting at a banquet amongst his friends, was nevertheless by the excellent skill of Timotheus, a famous musician, so inflamed with the fury of modus Orpheus, or as some say, Doris, that he called for his spear and target as if he would presently have addressed himself to war. But immediately thereafter, Case remarks the same Timotheus, seeing Alexander thus incensed only with the changing of a note, pacified his mood of his, and as it were, with a more mild and sound mollified and assuaged his former violence. Aside from the fact that Case has his modes mixed up here, Dorian as well as Phrygion might be considered a warlike mode, but modus Orpheus is a purely rhythmic term having nothing to do with melody. His account seems pretty much the standard one in English. It has been observed how Cowley, Burton, Playford, and Jeremy Collier, among others, all have versions of differing details of the Timotheus story. As a probable source, Collier's recounting of the story has its date of appearance, 1697, and the liveliness of the scene is sketches on its side. Quote, one time when Alexander was at dinner, this man played him a Phrygian air. The prince immediately rises, snatches up his lance, and puts himself in the posture of fighting, and the retreat was no sooner sounded by the change of the harmony, but his arms were grounded and his fire extinct, and he sat down as orderly as if he'd come from one of Aristotle's lectures. I warrant you, Demosthenes would have been flourishing about such a business. A long hour may not have done it neither, but Timotheus had a nearer cut to the soul. He could neck a passion at a stroke and lay it asleep. Here, as throughout this essay, incidentally, Collier seems to have been motivated by common sense as much as by his traditional modal ethos. Quote, by altering the notes and the time, unquote, he carefully remarks, he could sweeten a hearer's, quote, humor at a trice. He could just sweeten his humor at will. Any late 17th century audience could comprehend such a notion that made no appeal to what had become the purely literary schemata of the power of the music of antiquity. But however it came to him, the story of Timotheus was Dryden's program. As the ultimately persuasive powers of music were his theme. The old unity keeps to the story, and it is only in the 7th strophe that Saint Cecilia is allowed to appear in a cadential, climatic way as far as the overall structure of the ode is concerned. Dryden has not only repeated the closing lines of each strophe as a chorus, but he has so arranged each stanza that the truncated section, brilliant and summary in itself, would be no mere caudal appendage, but bound to the rest by a rhyme and metrical phrase. The end of the 3rd strophe, for example, starts out with the announcement of the arrival of Bacchus. Now give the hot boy's breath, he comes. Bacchus ever fair and young, drinking joys did first ordain. Bacchus' blessings are a treasure, drinking is the soldier's pleasure. Rich the treasure, sweet the pleasure, sweet is pleasure after pain. We get to hear the poem again, you see, in analysis. The last 5 lines are repeated as a chorus, and the repetitions and echoing of short phrases attest here, as elsewhere throughout the poem, to Dryden's concern for the safety of his text during the process of setting. But overall scheme allows the various stanzas to contain, each within itself, a separate episode of feeling appropriate to the action of each episode, so simplified throughout each strophe, in particular in the chorus. Thus, in the first one, the scene is laid, and Alexander, quote, the lovely Thais, and his, quote, valiant peers are shown feasting after the victory over the Xerxes. Quote, their brows with roses and with myrtles bound, so should desert in arms be crowned. The atmosphere is one of love following victory, the myrtle of Venus and the sensual rose. It is pointed out as the proper cordon of warlike prowess. Alexander and Thais, quote, in flower of youth and beauty's pride, are invoked in the chorus. Happy, happy, happy pair. None but the brave, and none but the brave. None but the brave deserves the fair. And here's the first of many cases that brilliant shift from iambic to tropaic measures to the pentatonic dactyls, such as those of, quote, none but the brave, etc., which marks in particular the prosodical artistry of the whole poem. It seems they are impressed with the poem. The next section introduces Timotheus, quote, Timotheus, placed on high amid the tuneful choir, unquote, surely not complimented in these lines, although the cliché of praise seems to be in evidence here, but rather depicted as the high choir loft or musician's chamber gallery under the, quote, vaulted roofs, unquote, of a sumptuous palace. In contrast to this, however, his playing is elaborately praised, as we are told how he quote, with flying fingers touched the lyre, The trembling notes ascend the sky and heavenly joys inspire. And while, quote, heavenly joys, unquote, commends rather than describes, the remainder of the second section is devoted to the treatment of the theme of the Imperium, the muse governing this stanza. And Timotheus' first song is Cleo. The song began from Jove, who left his blissful steps above. Such is the power of mighty love. A dragon's fury form bellied below the god. Sublime on radiant spires he rode, when he to fair Olympia pressed, and while he sought her snowy breast, then round her slender waist he curled, and stamped an image of himself, a sovereign of the world. But the muse has become the patron of fiction rather than of history. The story recorded in Plutarch of how Alexander's mother, Olympias, claimed to have been impregnated by some divine dragon, was one which Dryden had elsewhere condemned in no uncertain terms. Quote, ye princes, raised by poets to the gods, and Alexander up in lying odes, believe not every flattering knave's report. He didn't believe it. He warns the reader of his rewriting of Chaucer's Nun's Priest Tale, but here the fiction is identified with the magic of the music and is raised at the end when we are told that Timotheus, quote, raised a mortal to the skies. So at the one time he's rejecting like the claims of the dragon, but then he says that the music raised a mortal to the skies, almost as if the greatest triumph of his musicianship had been the creation of the noble fiction of Alexander's divine paternity. But it is as a god that Alexander is claimed by the crowd at the end of the strophe. Quote, a present deity, they shout around, a present deity, the vaulted roofs abound. With ravished ears the monarch hears, assumes the god, affects to nod, and seems to shake the spheres. Here he just seems to shake them. If the spheres are disturbed as a result of Timotheus's transcendent musicianship, it is only through the almost rabble-rousing effects of his music and his fictions that create a din on the one hand and half convince all that the monarch assumes the god on the other. Only here and in the entire poem is the heavenly apparatus in evidence. The myth of music throughout is the effective one in terms of which music activates feeling through the medium of sense. And from this point on, Timotheus' playing is to move by persuasion rather than to affect through lying. We are reading about Alexander's Feast by John Dryden, analysis of the poem in the Untuning of the Sky, Ideas of Music and English Poetry.